The cream-colored envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. Through the translucent paper, I could make out my mother's perfect calligraphy, the same handwriting that had once spelled out, "We're disappointed in you," in my graduation card. I'm Autumn, and at 34, I've learned that family invitations usually come with strings attached, especially when they arrive 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. My phone buzzed. Marissa's name flashed across the screen. "Tell me you got one too," she said without greeting. "If you mean Mother's annual guilt trip disguised as holiday hospitality, then yes. You have to come this year." Marissa's voice dropped to a whisper. "Things are different. Julian's bringing his new wife." The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. I pressed my palm against the cool marble countertop. "Paige, they're actually inviting her to the family dinner? Oh, it gets better. Aunt Prudence is treating her like the daughter she never had. But that's not even the real story." Marissa paused. "The family business is in trouble. Big trouble." "What do you mean?" "I overheard Dad and Uncle Roger talking. They're desperate for capital. Something about bad investments and Ezra's mismanagement. They don't know I know, but..." She took a breath. "They're planning to ask Julian for help." I barked out a laugh. "Julian? The same Julian who couldn't manage his own checking account when we were married? Apparently, he's done well for himself. Or at least that's what they think." Another pause. "But here's the thing. I've been doing some digging. Remember Grandma's inheritance? The one everyone thought went to charity?" My hand froze on the envelope. "What about it?" "It didn't. And you need to talk to Grayson about this. Soon." The doorbell rang, making me jump. Through the window, I spotted my mother's Mercedes in the driveway. "I have to go. Prudence just showed up unannounced. Again." "Don't let her bully you into anything," Marissa warned. "And Autumn? Be careful who you trust." I opened the door to find my mother clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "You weren't answering my calls?" she said, brushing past me. "I've been busy. Too busy for family." She surveyed my kitchen with barely concealed disapproval. "I assume you received the invitation?" "Just now, actually." "Good. We expect you to be there. Julian and Paige will be attending, and it would look unfortunate if you weren't present." I crossed my arms. "Unfortunate for whom exactly?" "Don't be difficult, Autumn. This dinner is important for the family. Your father and Ezra have some business matters to discuss, and we need to present a united front." "United front?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Like when you all united behind Julian during the divorce?" Her face tightened. "That was 3 years ago. It's time to move on. Julian has." "Clearly." I picked up the envelope, still unopened. "Why now, Mother? Why invite them both this year?" She adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous tell I'd recognized since childhood. "Times change. Family is family. And sometimes we need to adapt." My phone buzzed with a text from Marissa. "Don't tell anyone you talk to me. Call Grayson ASAP." Mother's eyes darted to my phone. "Is that work?" "Something like that." I smiled, remembering Marissa's warning about the family business. "Tell me, how is Ezra doing with the company?" A flicker of something, worry, fear, crossed her face before she composed herself. "Splendidly. Your brother has always had a head for business, unlike..." She trailed off. "Unlike me?" I finished for her. "The daughter who actually majored in finance?" "I should go," she said abruptly. "But you'll be there for Thanksgiving?" I thought about Julian and his new wife, about Ezra's apparent mismanagement, about Marissa's cryptic warnings. 3 years of swallowing my pride, of watching my family favor my ex-husband over their own daughter. "Of course," I said sweetly. I wouldn't miss it for the world. After she left, I finally opened the envelope. The invitation was typical Mother, elegant, formal, demanding, but it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made my blood boil. "Julian and Paige have wonderful news to share. Please dress appropriately." I grabbed my phone and dialed Grayson's number. If what Marissa suggested about the inheritance was true, this Thanksgiving was about to become very interesting indeed. As I waited for him to answer, I smiled, thinking of Julian's smug face, my mother's pearls, and all their carefully constructed facades. They had no idea what was coming. The phone connected. Grayson, we need to talk about my grandmother's will, and I'm going to need every document you can find before Thanksgiving. Grayson's office smelled of leather and old books, a sharp contrast to the modern glass building it occupied. He spread documents across his mahogany desk while I sat across from him, trying to process what he was telling me. Your grandmother was brilliant, he said, tapping a stack of papers. She saw this coming years ago. Saw what coming? The family's financial implosion. He handed me a document. She left everything to you, Autumn. Not your father, not Ezra, you. But she structured it in a way that kept everyone in the dark. I scanned the papers, numbers jumping out at me. My hands started shaking. This can't be right. These figures are very real. Grayson leaned forward. You own controlling interest in the family business through a series of shell companies. Your father and Ezra have been essentially working for you for the past 5 years without knowing it. A knock at the door interrupted us. His secretary poked her head in. Mr. Kelly, your next appointment is here. Give us 15 minutes, Sarah. He turned back to me. There's more. I received this yesterday. He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a letter, the handwriting unfamiliar. Julian's new marriage isn't what it seems, I read aloud. Paige Douglas has a history of targeting wealthy men during financial crises. Ask about her time in Boston. I had my investigator look into it, Grayson said. Paige has been married twice before, both times to men facing bankruptcy. Both times she walked away with substantial settlements. My phone buzzed. Another text from Marissa. Ezra's drinking at McCabe's. He's talking too much. Get here now. I have to go. I stood up. But first, what do I need to do to take control? Grayson pulled out another document. Sign here. Once filed, you'll have full voting rights. But Autumn... He caught my arm. Be careful. This kind of power shift can tear families apart. They already did that, I said, signing the paper. 3 years ago, when they chose Julian over me, 20 minutes later, I walked into McCabe's. The bar was nearly empty at 2 p.m., except for Ezra slumped over the counter and Marissa watching him from a corner booth. He's been here since lunch, she whispered as I sat down. Keeps talking about some deal going bad. Ezra looked up, his tie loose around his neck. Little sister, come have a drink with your failure of a brother. I slid onto the stool next to him. Rough day? Rough year. He laughed bitterly. You know what's funny? Dad always said I was the smart one, the responsible one. Now look at me. What happened, Ezra? He took another drink. I trusted the wrong people, made some investments that... He shook his head. Dad doesn't know how bad it is yet. But when he finds out... His phone rang. He checked it and went pale. It's Julian. Put it on speaker, I said quietly. Julian's voice filled the air between us. Ezra, we need to talk about that loan. My accountant reviewed the numbers, and I'm afraid I can't help unless I get controlling interest in the company. That's not possible, Ezra stammered. Dad would never... Your father won't have a choice once the board learns about your creative accounting. Think it over. We'll discuss it at Thanksgiving. The line went dead. Ezra put his head in his hands. I'm so screwed. Maybe not, I said, thinking of the papers I'd just signed. But you need to tell me everything, starting with what Julian knows. Why do you care? He looked at me suspiciously. You got out years ago. Because I'm your sister, and because I might be the only person who can help you. His laugh was hollow. You? No offense, Autumn, but what could you possibly do? I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of the inheritance documents. His eyes widened as he read. Holy shit, he whispered. Does anyone else know? Not yet, but they will. I stood up. Get yourself together, Ezra. Come to my place tonight. We need to talk strategy. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm. Autumn, wait. There's something else you should know about Julian and Paige. I overheard them last week. They're not just after the company. They're after everything. The real estate holdings, the trust funds, all of it. Let them try, I said, thinking of Grayson's signed papers in my bag. Thanksgiving is going to be very educational for everyone. Walking out, I heard Marissa behind me. You're really going to do this? I thought about my mother's dismissal, Julian's arrogance, and years of being underestimated. Watch me. Thanksgiving Day arrived with the subtle tension of an approaching storm. I pulled up to my parents' colonial mansion just as Julian's Tesla parked in front of me. Paige stepped out first, a vision in designer cashmere, carrying what looked like a store-bought pie. Autumn, she called out with manufactured warmth. I've heard so much about you. Funny, I replied, grabbing my own dish from the back seat. I've heard absolutely nothing about you. Julian appeared beside her, his arms sliding possessively around her waist. Play nice, Autumn. It's a holiday after all. Oh, I plan to make it memorable. Inside, the house was already buzzing with activity. Mother had outdone herself with the decorations, crystal, silver, and autumn flowers everywhere. She practically sprinted to greet Julian and Paige, barely acknowledging my presence. You brought pie, Mother cooed at Paige. How thoughtful. Autumn, put yours in the kitchen. Actually, I smiled. This is Grandmother's special cranberry sauce. You know, from her secret recipe? Mother's face tightened. She knew as well as I did that Grandmother had only passed that recipe to me. In the kitchen, Marissa was arranging appetizers. Ezra's in the study with Uncle Roger and Julian, she whispered. Something about emergency paperwork. Perfect timing. I checked my phone, a text from Grayson. Documents filed. You're officially in control. Good luck. I found them in the study, heads bent over papers. Julian looked up first, his confidence faltering slightly at my appearance. Family business, he said dismissively. Nothing that would interest you. Actually, I perched on the edge of my father's desk. I think it might. Roger straightened up. Autumn, please. We're handling some sensitive matters here. About the company's financial situation? The bad investments? Or perhaps about Julian's generous offer to bail us out? Ezra's face went white. Father's reddened. How did you know? I finished for him. I know a lot of things. Like how Julian's offer comes with strings that would give him controlling interest. And how Ezra's been cooking the books to hide his mistakes. That's enough. Father slammed his hand on the desk. This doesn't concern you. Dinner's ready. Mother's voice carried from the dining room, cutting through the tension. The dining room was a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. If Norman Rockwell painted passive-aggressive family dynamics, Mother had seated Paige in my usual spot, next to her. I took my assigned seat between Ezra and Marissa. Before we begin, Mother announced, Julian and Paige have wonderful news to share. Paige beamed, touching her stomach meaningfully. We're expecting. The table erupted in congratulations. I watched Julian closely. The slight tightening around his eyes told me this wasn't part of his plan. How wonderful, I said, raising my wine glass. Though I have to ask, does this happy announcement have anything to do with the prenup Julian's lawyer drew up last week? Silence fell like a hammer. Paige's smile flickered. How dare you? Mother started, but I cut her off. Or perhaps we should discuss the real reason everyone's so tense tonight. The company's imminent collapse? Julian's predatory takeover attempt? Or maybe Paige's interesting history with financially troubled businessmen in Boston? Autumn, Father's voice boomed. That's enough. No, it's not nearly enough. I pulled out my phone and pulled up an email. This just came in from the board of directors. Shall I read it aloud? Julian stood up, his face dark. This is neither the time nor place. It's exactly the time, I said, my voice steady. Because in about 30 seconds, everyone at this table is going to learn who really controls the family business, and has for the past 5 years. What are you talking about? Mother's hand went to her pearls. A text message lit up my phone. Grayson. Board members notified. Everything's in place. Well, I smiled, looking around the table. Since we're all sharing good news, I have an announcement of my own. Grandmother left me everything. The company, the real estate holdings, all of it. And I've spent the last week untangling Ezra's mess, stopping Julian's takeover, and preparing to take my rightful place as CEO. The turkey grew cold as chaos erupted around the table. But through it all, I noticed Paige quietly typing on her phone, her face calculating. Whatever game she was playing, it wasn't over yet. Perhaps, I said, raising my voice above the din, we should have dessert. I hear Paige brought pie. The kitchen became my refuge as the family processed my announcement. I was loading the dishwasher when Paige slipped in, closing the door behind her. That was quite a show, she said, leaning against the counter. I have to admit, I didn't see it coming. Like your pregnancy announcement? Her laugh was surprisingly genuine. Touché, though mine was significantly less expensive. What do you want, Paige? To make a deal. She glanced at the door. Julian doesn't know this, but I've been recording our conversations, including some rather interesting admissions about his plans for the company. I stopped loading plates. And I'm willing to hand them over. For a price, of course. Of course. I turned to face her. Why would you betray your husband? Especially now that you're supposedly carrying his child. She touched her stomach, smirking. Please, I'm as pregnant as that pie I brought is homemade. Julian's not the only one who can play games. The kitchen door swung open. Julian stood there, his face unreadable. Having a nice chat? Just getting to know my sister-in-law better, Paige said sweetly. Funny. Julian stepped in, closing the door. Because I just got an interesting call from my lawyer. Seems someone's been accessing my private files, using your passwords, Paige. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Paige's smile never wavered. Darling, you're being paranoid. Am I? He pulled out his phone. Should we call Robert in Boston? Or maybe Michael in Seattle? I'm sure they'd love to hear from their ex-wife. I moved between them. Take it somewhere else. Stay out of this, Autumn, Julian snapped. You've done enough damage tonight. Have I? Because from where I'm standing, you're the one who tried to steal my family's company while hiding your new wife's interesting past. The door opened again. Marissa poked her head in. Aunt Prudence is asking for more wine and, oh. She took in the scene. Should I come back? No need, Paige said, straightening up. I was just leaving, but Autumn? She reached into her purse and pulled out a USB drive. Consider my offer. You might find the contents illuminating. She brushed past Julian, who grabbed her arm. We're not finished. Oh, but we are. She smiled coldly. Check your email, darling. I've already contacted my lawyer. After they left, Marissa whistled low. Well, that was intense. Get Ezra, I said, turning the USB drive over in my hands. Tell him to meet me in Father's study in 5 minutes. In the study, I found my father slumped in his leather chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Why didn't you tell me? He asked as I entered. About the inheritance? Would you have believed me? Or would you have dismissed it like everything else I've ever done? He flinched. I deserve that. Yes, you do. I sat across from him. But right now we have bigger problems. Julian's not going to back down easily, and Paige just threw a wild card into the mix. Ezra slipped in, closing the door. What's the plan? I held up the USB drive. First, we find out what's on this. Then we... A crash from the dining room interrupted us, followed by raised voices. We rushed out to find Julian and Paige in a full-blown argument, Mother trying desperately to maintain decorum. You think I didn't know about the offshore accounts? Paige was saying, her voice carrying. About the money you've been hiding from your own family? Julian lunged for her purse, but she was faster. Paper spilled across the turkey, gravy seeping into what looked like bank statements. Enough, I shouted. Everyone froze. Mother, I suggest you break out the good scotch. Marissa, get Grayson on the phone. Father, secure the doors. No one leaves until we sort this out. You can't keep us here, Julian protested. Actually, I can. This is my house now. Or did you forget that part of grandmother's will? I picked up one of the soaked documents. Now, let's talk about these accounts, Julian. And maybe you can explain why you've been embezzling from the company while trying to take it over. Paige laughed, a sharp, victorious sound. Oh, he won't tell you. But I will. Every last detail. Mother sank into a chair, her perfect Thanksgiving in ruins. But as I watched Julian's face drain of color, I realized this dinner was turning out exactly as it needed to. Well, I said, pouring myself a glass of wine. Since we're all here, why don't we start with the truth? All of it. Father's scotch didn't last long as Paige methodically laid out Julian's schemes. Each revelation hit like a body blow, especially to my mother, who'd championed him for years. The real estate deal in Phoenix? Paige pulled up emails on her phone. A front. The money went straight to his account in the Caymans. That's a lie, Julian snarled, but his face had gone ashen. Is it? I connected my laptop to the dining room TV, displaying the documents from Paige's USB drive. Because these transfer records say otherwise? Ezra leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Wait, those dates. That was right when I needed capital for the expansion project. Which Julian knew would fail, Paige added. He was counting on it. Mother slammed her glass down. I won't listen to these accusations. Julian has been nothing but... A con man? I interrupted. Let me show you something else. I pulled up another document. Remember when he convinced you to refinance the summer house to invest in a sure thing? Here's where that money actually went. The room fell silent as the numbers told their story. Julian had been bleeding the family dry for years, positioning himself to swoop in as savior while orchestrating the very crisis he planned to solve. You bastard, Father whispered, the first time I'd ever heard him swear. We trusted you. Julian stood up, straightening his tie. This is all circumstantial and irrelevant. The fact remains that the company needs capital, which only I can provide. Actually, Grayson's voice came through the speakerphone Marissa had set up. That's not true. Autumn now controls all voting shares, and as of an hour ago, the board has approved her emergency refinancing plan. What plan? Ezra asked. The one that saves the company without selling our soul to the devil, I said. Though speaking of souls, I turned to Paige. Your turn. Why reveal all this now? She smiled, removing her wedding ring. Insurance. Julian's not the only one who knows how to play the long game. I needed proof of his fraud before I could safely leave. Leave? Julian laughed harshly. With what? Everything you have is because of me. No. She pulled out another phone. A burner. Everything I have is documented evidence of your crimes. The FBI will be very interested in those offshore accounts. The color drained from Julian's face. You're bluffing. Try me. She stood up. I've already sent copies to my lawyer. If anything happens to me, it all goes public. Mother buried her face in her hands. This can't be happening. Oh, but it is, I said. And now for the final piece. I pulled up one last document. Ezra, remember those contracts you signed last month? The ones Julian insisted had to be done immediately? Ezra nodded slowly. They were forgeries. The signatures, the notary stamps, all fake. Which means all those toxic assets you thought you'd taken on? They're actually still Julian's responsibility. You can't prove that, Julian said, but his voice shook. Wrong again. Grayson spoke up. We have the original documents, complete with security footage of Julian bribing the notary, who, by the way, has agreed to testify. Julian lunged for the door, but Marissa was faster, blocking his path. Move, he growled. Make me, she replied, her phone recording everything. Enough, Father's voice boomed. Julian, sit down. Autumn, what do you want? I looked around the room, at my shattered mother, my relieved brother, my calculating ex-husband, and his duplicitous wife. Years of manipulation and lies, all exposed over turkey and cranberry sauce. Here's what's going to happen, I said. Julian, you're going to sign a confession admitting to the fraud. In exchange, we won't press charges, provided you return every penny and disappear from our lives. And if I refuse? Paige laughed. Then I release everything. Your choice, darling. Mother, I turned to her. You need to decide right now. Stand with your family or with the man who nearly destroyed us. She looked at Julian, then at me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time. I've been such a fool. We all were, Father said quietly. Except Autumn. Marissa. I nodded toward the door. Please ask Grayson to come up. He's been waiting in the driveway with the papers. This isn't over, Julian said, but the fight had left his voice. Oh, but it is, I replied. Happy Thanksgiving, Julian. I hope the pie was worth it. As Marissa left to get Grayson, I caught Paige's eye. She gave me a slight nod, respect from one player to another. In the wreckage of our perfect family dinner, a new understanding was forming. Sometimes the truth is the sweetest revenge of all. Grayson arrived with a briefcase full of documents, looking more like an executioner than a lawyer. The dining room had transformed into an impromptu conference room, dessert plates pushed aside for legal papers. Sign here, he pointed, sliding the confession toward Julian. And here, initial each page. Julian's hand shook as he picked up the pen. This is blackmail. No, Grayson replied coolly. This is mercy. Would you prefer we discuss this with the SEC? While Julian signed, Paige emptied her purse onto the table. USB drives, recorded conversations, photographs. A paper trail of betrayal laid out between the pumpkin pie and coffee cups. I'll need copies of everything, Grayson told her. Already done. She smiled thinly. I learned from the best, didn't I, darling? Mother stood abruptly. I need air. She headed for the patio, but I caught her arm. Stay, I said firmly. You need to hear this part. What more could there possibly be? She asked, her voice breaking. Show them, Ezra said quietly. Show them what grandmother knew. I pulled up the final document on my laptop. This is grandmother's last letter to me, written a week before she died. She knew about Julian's schemes back then. She saw what none of us wanted to see. That's impossible, Julian interrupted. She was sick, confused. She was brilliant. I cut him off. And she had better investigators than you. Read it, Mother. Mother's hands trembled as she took the laptop. Her face crumpled as she read aloud. My dearest Autumn, I'm leaving everything to you because you alone have the strength to protect this family, even from itself. Julian has been embezzling for years, using Roger's trust and Prudence's blindness. They won't believe you if you tell them now. They'll need to learn the hard way, but when they do, be merciful. Family is all we truly have in the end. She knew, Father whispered, all this time. And she trusted me to fix it, I said. Which is exactly what I'm doing. Grayson gathered the signed documents. Everything appears to be in order. Julian, you have 48 hours to initiate the transfers. After that? I know, Julian snapped. He stood up, straightening his jacket with whatever dignity he had left. I suppose you're all very proud of yourselves. Proud? I laughed. No, but satisfied? Absolutely. I'll see myself out. He headed for the door, then turned back. Coming, Paige? She twirled her wedding ring on the table. I'll be filing for divorce in the morning. My lawyer will be in touch. After Julian left, the tension in the room shifted. Mother looked lost. Father appeared decades older, and Ezra couldn't stop staring at the evidence of his near downfall. What happens now? Marissa asked, breaking the silence. Now, I said. We rebuild. Ezra, you'll remain as COO, but with oversight. Father, you can keep your position as chairman, but all major decisions go through me. Mother. Yes? She looked up, tears in her eyes. You need to decide if you can accept me as I am. Not as the daughter you wished for, but as the woman grandmother knew I could be. She crossed the room and, for the first time in years, hugged me. I've been so wrong. About everything. Paige stood up, gathering her things. Well, this has been enlightening. Autumn, I assume our deal stands? As long as those records remain sealed, you'll receive the agreed-upon settlement. Perfect. She headed for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, he underestimated you from the start. That was his biggest mistake. After she left, Grayson started packing up his briefcase. I'll file everything first thing tomorrow. Autumn, do you need a ride home? Actually, I looked around at my shattered but surviving family. I think I'll stay. We have a lot to discuss. And pie to eat, Marissa added, trying to lighten the mood. Though maybe not Paige's. Father managed a weak laugh. I could use another drink. As everyone settled back around the table, Mother squeezed my hand. Your grandmother would be proud. I know, I said, thinking of her letter. But the real test isn't exposing the truth. It's what we do with it now. Ezra raised his glass. To new beginnings? To family, I corrected. The real kind. The kind that faces truth together. As we clinked glasses, I caught Grayson watching me with something more than professional interest. Maybe, I thought, there would be more than one new beginning coming from this night of revelations. The next morning, I arrived at the company headquarters before sunrise. The security guard did a double take. He'd never seen a member of the family this early. But everything was about to change. Ezra was already waiting in the conference room, nursing a coffee and looking surprisingly sober. Couldn't sleep either, he asked as I sat down. Too much to do. I spread out the transition documents Grayson had prepared. The board meets in 2 hours. Are you ready? To admit I nearly tanked the company? Not really. To help me fix it, I corrected. The elevator dinged and Father walked in, followed by Grayson. Both carried thick folders. Julian's lawyers have been calling since dawn, Grayson announced. They're threatening litigation. Let them, I replied. We have everything documented. Father cleared his throat. The board members are arriving early. They want answers. Then let's give them some. I stood up as the first board members filed in, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, but was interrupted by a commotion outside. Julian burst through the door, his usual polish replaced by desperate anger. This meeting is illegal. I'm filing an injunction. Sit down, I commanded, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. You're still a shareholder, so you have the right to be here. But interrupt again and security will remove you. The board members murmured, watching the power dynamics shift in real time. As I was saying, I continued, you've all received evidence of systematic fraud within our company. What you haven't seen yet is our path forward. I clicked through a presentation laying out the recovery plan. With each slide, the tension in the room shifted from anxiety to cautious optimism. The offshore accounts will be repatriated, I explained. Ezra has already begun unwinding the toxic investments. And our new compliance protocols? This is ridiculous. Julian stood again. She has no experience. I have an MBA from Wharton. I cut him off. And unlike you, I actually earned it. Mr. Rodriguez, would you like to share the audit findings? The head of accounting stood up. We've confirmed Ms. Autumn's allegations. The fraud extends back 3 years, primarily through... As he detailed Julian's schemes, I watched my ex-husband shrink in his chair. The board members' expressions hardened with each revelation. My phone buzzed. A text from Marissa. Mother's here, with Paige. Moments later, they both walked in. Mother looked like she hadn't slept, but her head was high. Paige carried a laptop. Sorry to interrupt, Paige said smoothly. But I thought the board might want to see this. She connected her laptop to the projector. Julian's private emails about the takeover plan, including some interesting conversations with certain board members. 2 of the older board members suddenly looked ill. That won't be necessary, I said. Those board members have already offered their resignations. Haven't you, gentlemen? They nodded stiffly, gathering their things. You can't do this. Julian tried one last time. The shareholders have already been notified, Grayson interrupted. The SEC too. Face it, Julian. It's over. The vote was unanimous. Within an hour, I was officially CEO, Ezra was confirmed as COO, and Julian was escorted from the building. One last thing. I addressed the remaining board members. This company was built on family values, real ones. We lost sight of that, but never again. Every decision we make from now on will reflect that commitment. After the meeting, Mother approached my new office. I never thought I'd see you here. That was the problem, I said, but without bitterness. You never looked. I'm looking now. She smiled sadly. Your grandmother's portrait arrived this morning. I thought it belonged here. She gestured to where workers were hanging the painting. Grandmother's eyes seemed to twinkle with approval as Grayson knocked on the door. The press is waiting, he said. Ready to face them? Actually, I looked at Mother, then Ezra, who'd joined us. We should do this as a family. The real story isn't about Julian's fraud or my takeover. It's about redemption. And second chances. Mother added softly. As we headed toward the press conference, Grayson caught my arm. Dinner tonight? To celebrate? I'd like that. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past lifting. Ezra grinned. Just don't serve pie. We laughed, and for the first time in years, it felt genuine. The cameras were waiting, the reporters ready with their questions. But we weren't hiding anymore. The truth had set us free, and the future finally looked bright. The winter sun streamed through my office window as I reviewed the quarterly reports. A knock at the door made me look up. Marissa entered, waving a newspaper. Have you seen this? She dropped it on my desk. The headline read, Former CEO pleads guilty to fraud charges. Julian finally took the deal, I said, scanning the article. Better than prison. She perched on my desk. Paige called. She's settling in Miami with her settlement money. Says she's done with marriage for a while. My phone buzzed. Ezra was calling from the factory floor. I put him on speaker. The new production line is up and running, he reported. Workers love the profit-sharing program. We're already seeing increased efficiency. Good. How's the community outreach going? Amazing. The scholarship program has 15 applicants already. Grandmother would have loved it. A warm feeling spread through my chest. We'd named the scholarship after her, supporting young women in business. It felt right. Mother appeared in the doorway, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. Ready for lunch? Your father's waiting downstairs. Actually, Grayson stepped in behind her. I was hoping to steal Autumn away. There's something I need to show her. Mother smiled knowingly. Of course. We'll reschedule. Grayson drove us to a familiar place, the small park where I used to hide after arguments with Julian. But today, it was transformed. A small table had been set up under the trees, complete with champagne. What's this about? He pulled out an envelope. The final paperwork. Julian's shares have been officially transferred back to the company. It's really over. That deserves a toast. I reached for the champagne, but he caught my hand. There's more. He seemed nervous suddenly. I've been offered a partnership at my firm. My heart sank. In New York? No. He smiled. Here, I'm staying, if you'll have me. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Ezra again. Turn on the news, now. Grayson pulled it up on his phone. A reporter stood outside our company headquarters. In a surprising turn of events, former CEO Julian Douglas's attempt to flee the country has been thwarted. Sources say his private jet was stopped just before takeoff, thanks to an anonymous tip. I looked at Grayson. Anonymous tip? Paige, he admitted. She called this morning, said it was her final gift to the family. My phone buzzed with a text from Father. Come to the house. Important family meeting. At my parents' home, we found the family gathered in the study. Father stood by Grandmother's portrait, holding an old leather journal. Found this while cleaning out the storage room, he said. It's your grandmother's diary. There's something you need to see. He opened to a marked page and read, Today I watched Autumn standing up to that boy who tried to take credit for her science project. She reminds me of myself, stronger than anyone knows. When the time comes, she'll be ready. The others may not see it yet, but she'll save this family from itself. Mother wiped her eyes. She knew you so well. Better than we did, Father added. But we're learning. Ezra raised his glass. To grandmother's wisdom, and to family, I added, looking at Grayson, both old and new. Speaking of new, Marissa grinned. When are you two making it official? Grayson squeezed my hand. Actually, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from an unknown number. You did good, kid. Julian won't bother you again. P. I smiled, putting the phone away. The past was settled. The future was bright. And right here, in this moment, surrounded by truth and love and second chances, everything felt exactly as it should be. So, I looked at my family. Really looked at them. Who's ready to start our own traditions? Mother laughed. As long as it doesn't involve surprise revelations over turkey. No promises, I said, but I was smiling too. The winter sun painted the study golden, warming grandmother's portrait. In the light, she seemed to smile, as if she'd known all along how this would end. Not with revenge, but with redemption. Not with victory, but with understanding. And as Grayson pulled out a small velvet box, I realized some stories don't end. They just transform into something better than we could have imagined. The family gathered closer, ready for one more surprise, one more moment of joy. We were different now. Stronger, wiser, more honest. Just as grandmother had planned all along.
My name is Sally. I am a 16-year-old in the 11th grade. This story is a record of an event that profoundly changed my life. Even now, I sometimes wonder if the choice I made at that time was the right one. But every time, I am convinced that my decision was not wrong. Sitting in front of the white dressing table, I noticed that my favorite mascara, which I had been using for years, was missing. It was one of the gifts my father had chosen for my 16th birthday. It was an expensive branded cosmetic, but more importantly, it was a precious item filled with the deep love of my father, who lived far away. It disappeared again. I muttered to myself without speaking aloud, and sighed deeply. I felt the anxiety growing larger inside my heart. Moreover, 2 pairs of my favorite branded sneakers, which my father had bought for special occasions, also disappeared suddenly. Day by day, the anxiety and frustration of losing my treasured items were eating away at me. It has been a year since I started living with my mother, my stepfather Douglas, and my stepbrother Thomas. On the surface, it seemed like a peaceful home where we lived as a new family. But beneath that calm surface, reality was heading in a completely different direction. Every day, little by little but surely, I felt as if everything was falling apart, weighing heavily on my heart. It has been 7 years since my parents divorced. I was in the 3rd grade, 9 years old at the time. I was so shocked that I thought the world might end, but my parents prioritized me even after the divorce. They had many discussions and chose joint custody. They planned a detailed schedule so I could spend equal time with both of them. However, 4 years ago, that stable life underwent a major change. My father was unexpectedly promoted to a higher position at his company. It was a joyful event accompanied by a salary increase, but at the same time, he could not avoid a transfer to a distant location. At 12 years old, I struggled with the decision and ultimately chose to live with my mother, as I did not want to leave the familiar friends and school environment. My father accepted my decision with deep understanding and love. In fact, he continued to provide both financial and emotional support so that I could lead a fulfilling life. To make life with my mother more stable, my father readily agreed to pay child support, which was a significant 20% of his income. 3 years ago, my mother had a fateful encounter with Douglas. I later learned it was a chance meeting at a school parent meeting. Douglas had a son, Thomas, who was 1 year older than me. Douglas seemed to be a gentle and thoughtful person, and since Thomas attended the same school as me, I believed everything would work out well. However, that expectation did not last long. Douglas and Thomas moved into our house on a calm spring day. Douglas was tall, always well-dressed in a clean suit, and never without a gentle smile. Thomas was the same height as me, an active boy who excelled in sports. At first, I had high hopes for life with this new family. But those hopes melted away like spring snow in no time. The changes began at the dinner table. Previously, my mother and I would talk cheerfully about what happened at school or our dreams for the future during meals. Now, those conversations were gradually replaced by Douglas and Thomas's discussions. My mother listened to them attentively, nodding along, making me feel as if I were invisible. "Sally, why don't you say something?" Occasionally, my mother would encourage me to speak. But soon enough, Douglas or Thomas would bring up a new topic, leaving my words hanging in the air. Even weekend family outings started to be planned without me, going to the movies or shopping at the mall. These plans were made without my knowledge, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Oh, I forgot to tell you, Sally. I'm so sorry." Even when she apologized later, it sounded like empty words to me. In my heart, loneliness and anger slowly began to pile up. What hurt more was the change in my mother. The mother I used to know would always be there for me, understanding my feelings. But now, she seemed like a completely different person, siding with Douglas and Thomas and pushing me to the background. "Mom, please listen to me." Even when I pleaded with her, her response was always the same. "You have your father, don't you? Thomas has no one else." Those words seeped into my heart like poison. It's true that I have my father, but that doesn't justify my mother neglecting me. Thomas had a girlfriend his age, Nora. He often invited her to our house, and she grew close to Douglas and my mother. Amidst all this, my belongings started to disappear. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But as more things went missing, I became certain it wasn't a coincidence. It felt like only expensive cosmetics or gifts from my father were being targeted. The first thing I noticed missing was the luxurious hand cream my father had given me for my birthday. Since I used it every night before bed, I realized it was gone right away. Initially, I thought it might have been due to my own carelessness, so I searched my entire room. It must be somewhere. I told myself this as I searched deep into my closet. But I couldn't find it. After that, my favorite lip gloss, a new eyeshadow palette, and even the special mascara my father had chosen for me vanished, as if they had disappeared into thin air. When I talked to my mother about it, she initially suspected the housekeeper. She was a part-time worker who came twice a week. Although she had been a trusted person for years, my mother took my claims seriously and eventually decided to terminate her contract. "I'm sorry, but my daughter's important belongings have been disappearing." When my mother told her this, the housekeeper nodded sadly. She had worked for us for over 20 years. I felt a lingering sense of guilt in my heart. However, even after the housekeeper stopped coming, the items continued to disappear. This time, even shoes became a target. In particular, the expensive sneakers my father had bought for me started vanishing one by one. One day, while I was casually scrolling through social media, I came across a post by Thomas's girlfriend, Nora. In the photo, she was wearing a pair of shoes I immediately recognized. They were unmistakably my treasured sneakers. I felt my heartbeat quicken. But there was no concrete proof that they were mine. It was possible that she had simply bought the same pair of sneakers. Still, my heart felt clouded with unease. Then one day, I heard the sound of the front door opening and instinctively called out, "Thomas, welcome home." But the person who walked into the living room was his girlfriend, Nora. "Nora, why are you here? The front door should have been locked." I was so shocked that I raised my voice without thinking. Hearing my voice, my mother rushed out of her room. "What's wrong, Sally?" "Mom." Nora unlocked the front door and came in. "Oh, the other day, Thomas asked if he could give Nora a spare key." Well, I didn't think it would be a problem. While I stood there confused, Nora cheerfully said, "Hello, Mom. Sally. I'm sorry if I startled you. It's fine." I hadn't told Sally yet, so it's no wonder she's surprised. My heart was filled with distrust. Why does someone who's not family need a spare key? I have a right to privacy too. This is unacceptable. I shouted without thinking, and both my mother and Nora exchanged bewildered looks. "Sally, don't say such things. Nora is an important person to Thomas, and doesn't matter. Mom, who's more important to you, me or Thomas? I can't stand this house anymore." Tears welled up in my eyes. But the words I had hoped to hear from my mother never came. "Sally, how could you say such a thing? Thomas and Nora are important family members too. If you can't understand that, you should leave this house." With that, my mother brought out the key to the second house and handed it to me. "Take some time to cool off." Devastated by her words, I snatched the key roughly. I went to my room, packed only the essentials, and left the house, holding back my tears. And so began my life at the second house. The second house wasn't far from home, but it was an old house with poor maintenance, making it quite inconvenient. However, since I no longer had a place in my own home, I had no choice but to adapt to this new life. After getting somewhat accustomed to life at the second house, I came across Nora's social media post and thought to myself, I can't let this continue. I need to make things clear. That morning, I made an important decision. I immediately contacted my father. He listened to me earnestly and took action right away. My conversation with him turned out to be more constructive than I had expected. "Sally, your safety is the top priority, but to solve this problem, we need solid evidence." My father calmly analyzed the situation and gave me advice. He also arranged for a consultation with a lawyer, allowing us to create an appropriate plan of action from a legal perspective. The following weekend, a small security camera my father sent arrived. It was a state-of-the-art wireless camera that allowed real-time monitoring through a smartphone. I carefully devised a plan. Pretending to bring some belongings back, I returned to my family home and secretly installed the cameras. I checked the camera placement, angles, and locations multiple times to ensure they would capture sufficient evidence. I decided to place one camera in the gap between the bookshelf and another inside the closet. Perfect. When I finished setting them up, I felt a small sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just about security. It was the first step in protecting my rights. For the following week, I continued my usual routine while collecting evidence. During the day, I attended school. At night, I studied at the second house. Amidst this ordinary life, the cameras kept recording reliably. The decisive evidence was captured on the 6th day after installation, at 2 a.m. I woke up to the notification sound from my smartphone. Motion detected. When I opened the screen, the exact moment was displayed. Thomas was quietly opening the door to my room and stepping inside. He moved cautiously, as if he had rehearsed this many times, and approached my dressing table. I held my breath and continued watching the screen. I could feel my heart pounding intensely. Thomas opened the drawer and started rummaging through my cosmetics. His movements were practiced, clearly indicating this wasn't his first time. When he placed the cosmetics into his bag, his expression showed not a trace of guilt. Then, the most shocking moment came. He took out his smartphone and began sending a message. The audio was recorded clearly. "This will make your birthday present perfect. It's a high-end brand eyeshadow palette." His voice even carried a sense of pride, as if he had bought it himself. Next, he turned to the closet and started rummaging through my shoes. He picked up a new pair of sneakers and sent another message. "I'll include these too. I'm sure you'll love them." In that moment, something inside me shifted decisively. This was no longer a mere family dispute. Hearing those words made something boil within me. It wasn't anger, but a feeling closer to sadness. A deep sense of disappointment at how a relationship that should be built on trust as family had been so distorted. This was a clear act of crime, and it required immediate action. I saved the video and contacted my father right away. Despite the late hour, my father answered the phone immediately. "The evidence is solid." His voice was calm. With the evidence in hand, I consulted with my father to plan our next steps. I wanted to aim for a fundamental resolution, not mere retaliation. "We'll consult the lawyer first thing tomorrow. Until then, act as usual. It's crucial not to arouse suspicion." My father took swift action. After consulting with the lawyer, he also discussed the situation with the police, ensuring they were prepared to intervene if necessary. Then, one Saturday afternoon, a meeting was arranged with my father, mother, Douglas, Thomas, and the school's advisory teacher. The atmosphere in the counseling room was heavy. When my mother, Douglas, and Thomas arrived, the tension in the room grew even stronger. My mother wore a confused expression. Douglas crossed his arms in silence. Thomas stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Today, we need to discuss an important matter," the advisor began quietly. His voice was calm and steady, befitting an experienced teacher. "Sally has made a serious complaint." At those words, my mother leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "She has accused Thomas of taking her personal belongings." "That's... Sally, how could you say such a thing?" "Exactly. How dare you accuse him without proof? Thomas would never do something like that." Both my mother and Douglas protested, their faces turning red with anger. Seeing this, I subtly signaled my father with my eyes. He nodded and opened my laptop. The footage from the security camera began to play. It showed Thomas sneaking into my room late at night. He rummaged through my cosmetics and packed them into his bag. The audio of his phone conversation followed. Everything was recorded in vivid detail. As the video played, I could feel the air in the room freeze. Thomas's face turned pale. Douglas's eyes widened in shock. My mother covered her mouth with her hands, her expression one of disbelief. When the video ended, there was a moment of silence. It was Thomas who broke it. "This is not true. It's a misunderstanding." He began denying it in a trembling voice, but his agitation was evident. "I bought them with my own allowance. The same one Sally has." Douglas stepped forward to defend his son. "That's right. There's no way my son is a thief. And isn't this kind of surveillance illegal? The lawyer responded calmly. The installation of this security camera is a legitimate self-defense measure to protect private property. In fact, breaking and entering in the middle of the night along with theft are far more serious illegal acts. Douglas's expression twisted. Then maybe Sally showing off her expensive things tempted him. Lavish gifts from her father. What else do you expect when she flaunts them like that? Hearing those words, I almost shouted out. Blaming the victim while ignoring the crime was infuriating. However, my father placed a hand on my shoulder, encouraging me to remain calm. "Mr. Douglas?" My father began Nather in a quiet but firm tone. "Do you think justifying your child's actions is appropriate as a parent?" The room grew even heavier with those words. Douglas was at a loss for words, his mouth hanging open in shock. Faced with undeniable evidence, Thomas had no choice but to concede. An agreement was reached to return the stolen items and pay a settlement. Considering Douglas's own standing, it was clear they wanted to avoid involving the police. A significant settlement amount was agreed upon. According to Thomas, the stolen items had been used for leisure money or given to his girlfriend. Then my mother spoke. "Sally, did you really have to go this far?" Her voice was trembling. "Thomas is still just a child. We're family. Can't you be a little more forgiving?" At that moment, something inside me broke irrevocably. It felt as though the last bit of hope I held on to had shattered completely. "Family?" My voice sounded colder than I had expected. "Mom, aren't I your daughter? Why do you only protect Thomas?" My mother faltered, unable to respond, and looked away. Then my father spoke, his tone calm but resolute. "There is another issue we need to address." He pulled out his smartphone. "I'd like an explanation regarding the use of the child support I've been providing." I saw the color drain from my mother's face. My father began presenting evidence, screenshots of my mother's social media posts, and records of extravagant purchases. Proof that the child support meant for me had been spent on my mother's luxuries and on Douglas and Thomas. I've been paying 20% of my income as child support. This was meant for Sally's education and living expenses. But looking at how it's actually been used, my mother, pale and shaken, collapsed into a chair. Douglas looked confused, his gaze darting between my mother and my father. That's... My mother finally managed to speak, her voice strained. "It was necessary for our new family, too. I wanted Thomas to have a good environment as well." "You were using my child support for your new family?" My voice trembled. "Mom, was I just a source of income to you?" The advisor cleared his throat, trying to steer the conversation back on track. "Now then, regarding the resolution for this matter, I've already made my decision." I stood up and turned to my father. "I want to go live with you, Dad. I don't want to come back here anymore." The room fell completely silent at my words. My mother's face was filled with disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but couldn't find the words. "Sally, think this through calmly." After a moment, my mother managed to force out her voice. "What about school? Your friends? Your whole life is here." It was true, as she said. But that was no longer enough to hold me back. "I'll be fine," I replied quietly but firmly. "I've thought everything through." My father placed a hand on my shoulder and nodded gently. His presence gave me immense courage. "Now, let's discuss the specific procedures," the lawyer said as he pulled out some documents. "Sally is 16, so she has the right to designate her residence. With court approval, The discussions that followed felt like I was walking through a fog. Custody changes, termination of child support, transfer procedures for school. One by one, the concrete steps were decided. My mother vehemently resisted the decision, but I realized it was because she feared losing the child support payments. In the end, through discussions mediated by the lawyer, custody was transferred to my father. On the way home, I cried in my father's car. They weren't tears of sadness, but tears of relief from the burden I had been carrying. My father said nothing as he drove the car toward his home. "I need to go back for my belongings." "It's okay. You can pick up what you need later. For now, resting is the most important thing." That night, lying in the guest room at my father's house, I felt a sense of relief for the first time in a long while. The room was simple but clean and calming. The day came to retrieve the rest of my belongings from my mother's house. My father offered to come with me, but I chose to go alone. As I was packing, my mother spoke to me. "Have you really decided? Are you truly not coming back?" "Yes, I've decided. This is my choice. The past is the past, and I'm ready to move forward with my life." My mother seemed like she wanted to say something, but remained silent in the end. I finished packing my last bag and headed to the front door. "Sally," she called out to me. With my hand on the doorknob, I paused for a moment. "Thank you, but I'm not coming back." "Goodbye, Mom." At my new school, I quickly made friends. Sometimes I think about my mother, but it's no longer with the same painful emotions as before. Instead, it's a quiet acceptance, accompanied by the certainty that I made the right choice. My father is still busy with work, but we spend more time together now. On weekends, we go to the movies or go shopping together. It feels like real parent-child time. The termination of child support had a significant impact on my mother and Douglas's life. Since the support from my father accounted for a large portion of her income, its loss hit their household finances hard. Douglas's salary alone wasn't enough to maintain their previous standard of living. They could no longer afford the mortgage on their house in the upscale neighborhood and had to move to a more affordable apartment complex. They also struggled to cover Thomas's private high school tuition, leading them to consider transferring him to a public school. However, I heard that even at his new school, after his actions came to light, he began to be distanced by his friends. My mother had to start working again, but after years as a housewife, the gap in her employment history made it difficult for her to find the job she wanted. She began juggling multiple part-time jobs. Occasionally, I received messages from my mother, crying about wanting to return to her old life. But there is no going back to those days. The decision I made at 16 brought significant changes. But they were necessary changes. The courage to protect my rights and pursue happiness. I learned that this is a right everyone deserves to have. Most importantly, I realized that family is not solely defined by blood relations. Through this experience, I deeply understood that true family is about relationships where people understand and support one another. It happened in the spring when I was 10 years old. It was a day our family would never forget. My father was making his special pancakes on a Sunday morning. The sweet, fragrant aroma wafted from the kitchen, while the sound of my mother humming as she set the table created a comforting background melody. My father had a knack for making pancakes shaped like bears and stars to make me laugh. Sunday mornings spent together were the epitome of our family routine. That morning, my father was his usual cheerful self, waving the frying pan like a magic wand. "Princess Jean, "Your special pancakes are ready," he said playfully. Leaving my favorite bunny plushie on the sofa, I eagerly ran to the kitchen. Little did I know that the event that followed would change our family forever. Suddenly, my father clutched his chest, and the spatula clattered noisily to the floor. At that moment, it felt as though time had stopped. I saw my father's face contort in pain, and he let out a soundless scream. My mother, though shaken, quickly grabbed the phone to call an ambulance, but I could only stand there frozen. I remember blankly watching as the ambulance arrived and took my father away. The sound of the siren echoed in the air. In the hospital's white corridor, I vividly recall seeing my mother collapse into tears. That day, my father passed away due to a heart attack. It was so sudden that we had no time to prepare. After my father was gone, the house was enveloped in an empty silence. The laughter and sweet smell of pancakes that once filled our home were replaced by a lifeless void. My mother tried to support me despite her grief, but she was also consumed by a profound sense of loss. About a year after my father's death, my mother met Solomon, her new partner. Solomon was tall and had kind, gentle eyes. He became a comforting presence, slowly filling the void in our hearts. They met through a support group for widows, and he exuded a reassuring warmth that reminded us of my father. When Solomon started visiting our home, the atmosphere began to change little by little. He helped me with my math homework and listened when I had a bad day at school. Even so, it took time for him to be accepted as part of our family. Eventually, my mother decided to remarry, and Solomon moved in with us a few months later. Around the time Solomon became a part of our family, we were blessed with a new life. I still clearly remember the day my mother told me, "You're going to be a big sister." Her eyes sparkled with excitement, but my heart was filled with mixed emotions. As our family took on a new form, the days when my father was with us felt increasingly distant. When my little sister was born, my mother's attention turned entirely to that tiny new presence. She decided to quit her job and devote herself to caring for my sister. "This early childhood period is so crucial for a child's development," she often said. But to me, those words felt like an announcement that I was no longer a priority in our family. As my mother became immersed in taking care of my sister, my daily life gradually changed. I came home from school to find no lunch prepared, and when I spoke to my mother, her ears were tuned only to my sister's cries. At the dinner table, my mother often ate while holding my sister, and I felt as though I wasn't even there. "Jean, do you know? Sometimes people become so absorbed in one thing that they forget about everything else," Solomon told me after dinner one evening. His words gave me a small sense of relief, but it didn't change the fact that my place in the family still felt unstable. Thus, our family, having lost my father, spent each day grappling with loneliness and inner conflicts as we tried to find a new form of togetherness. With Solomon becoming part of the family and the birth of my sister, our household took on a new shape. However, this change was not necessarily comfortable for me. My mother devoted herself entirely to caring for my sister, and her attention toward me gradually faded. It felt as though I had become an unimportant member of the family. Solomon tried hard to maintain balance in the household. He would take me to the park on weekends and attend school events. Even so, every time I saw my mother so engrossed with my sister, I felt a small seed of loneliness take root in my heart. That seed grew steadily over time. My mother often said, "This time is so important for her future." While I knew she wasn't lying, the phrase "for her future" felt like a denial of my present. One evening, Solomon knocked on my door and quietly spoke to me. "Jean, I understand that you feel like you're not being cared for, but you are important. Please don't forget that." His words felt like a lifeline to me. Still, every time I saw the unshakable bond between my mother and sister, I felt as though I was losing my place within the family. While Solomon tried to be there for me, my mother's unwavering focus on my sister left the atmosphere at home somewhat strained. A growing gap slowly formed between my mother and me. I still remember the day my sister first said, "Mama." The moment my mother heard it, she beamed with tears of joy and hugged my sister tightly. Watching that scene, I was overcome with a strange mix of happiness and sadness. It felt like I was part of the family, yet somehow observing it from the outside. As I watched my mother's love for my sister deepen day by day, I began to feel as though I was being pushed further away from the heart of the family. That sense of loneliness started to take root in my heart during this time. As my sister grew, my mother's expectations for her only grew larger. She became busy enrolling my sister in music and art classes, and our family's days revolved around those schedules. My mother's voice was always gentle when she spoke to my sister, and she celebrated even her smallest successes with exaggerated joy. In contrast, whenever I shared my achievements at school or in club activities, my mother would simply respond, "That's nice," before quickly shifting the conversation back to my sister. Even in such circumstances, Solomon always remained on my side. He listened to me attentively and sometimes encouraged me by saying, "You're really putting in a lot of effort." I can't express how much those words saved me. Without him, I might have been completely crushed by the loneliness I felt within the family. However, despite Solomon's efforts, the distance between my mother and me only grew wider. I felt as though my sister was the center of the family, while I was merely a satellite orbiting around her. This feeling became increasingly vivid as I grew older. On the surface, our family appeared peaceful, but inside me, small frustrations accumulated and gradually turned into a deep sense of loneliness. At the same time, tension began to arise between Solomon and my mother. Solomon tried to maintain fairness within the family, but he too started questioning my mother's excessive attention toward my sister. One evening during dinner, my sister pushed her plate away, refusing to eat. My mother sat beside her, patiently trying to persuade her, saying, "Just one more bite." Watching this, Solomon put down his fork and said, "Sally, you need to let her become more independent. You can't do everything for her." My mother's face immediately stiffened as she replied, "Are you saying I'm a bad mother?" Solomon responded calmly, "That's not what I'm saying. But she's not the only child in this family. Jean is your daughter too." However, it seemed those words didn't reach my mother. She retorted firmly, "She's still so young. She needs special care." The situation settled down somehow, but Solomon's words left a deep impression on me. Day by day, Solomon continued to try to support me. One day, he suggested that I join a karate class. I accepted his suggestion, and Solomon drove me to and from the class several times a week. The conversations we had on the way home after practice became a source of comfort for me. When I earned a belt during a match, I still remember how he cheered louder than any other parent. While I grew through my time with Solomon, the tension at home continued to escalate. Solomon suggested to my mother that she reduce her dependency on my sister, but instead of listening, my mother became increasingly defensive. When my sister expressed interest in trying Little League, Solomon said, "This could be a great opportunity." However, my mother immediately dismissed the idea. "Baseball is too dangerous. It's safer for her to attend art classes instead," she insisted, leaving Solomon speechless. Even in the art class chosen for my sister, she showed little enthusiasm and stopped attending after the third session. When my mother found out, she only blamed the teacher, saying, "The teacher doesn't understand children's creativity." This kind of attitude from my mother seemed to distort everything within our family. Over time, Solomon began to avoid clashing with my mother. However, it wasn't because he had given in to her. Instead, he focused on supporting me. "Jean, you're always trying so hard. Do you realize how amazing that is?" Those words of encouragement from him still remain in my heart. Without him, I might have been completely crushed by the loneliness within our family. On the other hand, the cracks within our household were becoming irreparable. Solomon was doing his best for me, but he couldn't mend his relationship with my mother. From this point on, the time we spent together as a family began to decrease. it became more common for us to eat dinner separately. The situation where my sister was the center of the family remained unchanged, and Solomon and I felt like isolated entities orbiting around her. By the time I was about to graduate high school, I had one clear goal in my heart. It was to leave the house and live an independent life. Exhausted from the loneliness and strained relationships with my mother and sister, I strongly wished to start a new life by going to college. My mother didn't seem to take my college plans seriously. While I was choosing schools, she would talk only about my sister's lessons and school events. Even when I asked for her opinion about my future, she would only give a curt response like, "Go wherever you like." On the other hand, Solomon continued to cheer me on. "Jean, the sky is the limit. Go wherever you want," he said, encouraging me. His words were my only source of support. On the day of my high school graduation, I wore my cap and gown and looked out at the audience from the stage. I saw Solomon smiling proudly at me. Next to him was my mother, who was staring at her smartphone, seemingly texting the babysitter for my sister. That scene felt like a symbol of my position within the family. The day after the graduation ceremony, Solomon called me into his study. Holding a folder in his hand, he said, "I've been saving bit by bit." He showed me brochures from various universities. "Jean, you can go anywhere. I want to help you carve out your future," he said, his words bringing tears to my eyes. However, when my mother heard about this, she argued, "That money should be used for your sister's future," leading to a heated argument with Solomon. That night, Solomon told me, "Jean, I'm not backing down on this. You have the right to your freedom." Encouraged by his words, I decided to go to college. In the end, I chose Marshall University in West Virginia. It was a place where I could maintain a suitable distance from my family while starting a new chapter in life. When college began, I tasted freedom for the first time. Being freed from the shadow of my family, I realized how precious it was to have my own time. I devoted myself to my studies, enjoyed time with friends, and pursued things I had always wanted to do. However, my relationship with my family grew increasingly distant. My mother rarely contacted me, and the only connection I had was through phone calls with Solomon. "Jean, your mother still seems busy with your sister," Solomon said during one of our calls. There was fatigue in his voice as he continued, "She's doing her best to raise her, but that doesn't necessarily mean things are heading in the right direction." I couldn't find the words to respond. Living away from my family gave me a new perspective. I rediscovered my own worth and was in the process of healing old wounds. At the same time, I realized that the problems within my family were unfolding beyond my reach, leaving me with complex feelings. A few years after graduating from college, my life was shaken by a significant event. Solomon passed away suddenly. He was the only person in my family who truly understood and supported me. His death brought me immense grief, but more than that, it revealed how completely the balance within our family had fallen apart. After Solomon's death, my mother began to struggle financially. Since Solomon had been the primary breadwinner, our household quickly approached the brink of collapse without him. My mother started to rely on me, especially demanding that I help fund my sister's college education. "Jean, please. If you don't help, her future will be ruined," my mother pleaded with tears in her eyes. Her words shook me. But considering my past relationship with my family and the life I had built for myself, I couldn't agree so easily. However, in the end, I decided to accept my mother's request. From then on, I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to pay for my sister's college expenses. Living a life of working from early morning until late at night drained me physically and mentally, yet I rarely received gratitude from my mother or sister. My mother accepted the money as if it were a given, and my sister showed little interest in the matter. Their cold attitudes left new scars on my heart. One day, when I visited my family home after a long time, I found it in worse condition than ever before. The garden that Solomon used to maintain was overgrown, and the living room was cluttered with my sister's belongings. My mother sat on the couch with a tired expression, barely looking at me as she muttered, "Welcome home." Seeing this, I realized that no matter how much effort I put into supporting this family, I would never be acknowledged. Eventually, the day came when my sister graduated from college and entered the workforce. My mother bought a new dress to attend the graduation ceremony, her face beaming with joy. However, behind that joy, I felt as if all my efforts had been ignored. I was left with a gaping hole in my heart. With Solomon gone, my family had become entirely focused on my mother and sister, leaving my presence increasingly insignificant. Enduring this situation was not easy, but I couldn't give up on my own life. A few years after Solomon passed away, and I had been funding my sister's college expenses, a decisive rift occurred in our family during my mother's birthday party. That day, family and relatives gathered, and on the surface, the atmosphere was pleasant. My mother was more talkative than usual, sipping wine after wine and in high spirits. During the gathering, she casually let something slip in her drunken state. "Actually, I've made a will to leave all my assets to your sister," she said with a laugh. The moment those words reached my ears, it felt as though time had stopped. It was as if my existence within this family had been completely erased. When I tried to ask why, my mother, showing no sign of remorse, replied, "Because she has her whole life ahead of her. You're already independent, aren't you?" Her words carried not a trace of gratitude or consideration for me. They simply reflected her values, which prioritized my sister above all else. In that instant, all the emotions I had buried deep inside came rushing out. How much I had sacrificed to support this family, devoting my time and money to secure my sister's future. Yet, the reality that this was how I was treated filled me with indescribable anger and sorrow. After returning home, I thought deeply. Should I continue being the sacrificial lamb for this family? What meaning was there in maintaining a relationship with my mother and sister? After much deliberation, I made a decision. I needed to distance myself from this family and reclaim my life. A few days later, I wrote a letter to my mother. The message was straightforward, expressing my resolve to cease further assistance and calmly explaining my reasons for distancing myself. "Please don't take everything I've done for granted. I have the right to live my own life," I wrote, pouring my emotions into that sentence. Additionally, I confirmed that the house my mother and sister lived in was under my name and decided to proceed with selling it. This action marked the final severance of my ties with the family. In truth, the house we lived in had been purchased by my late father in my name. It seemed my mother had forgotten this. When she realized she was losing her home, she immediately called me, but I didn't answer. Her messages were filled with anger and confusion, asking, "Why are you doing this?" But I felt no obligation to respond. I couldn't find a reason to keep sacrificing myself any longer. Since I wasn't going to inherit anything, I decided to sell the house and use the proceeds for myself. While there was sadness in letting go of something my father had given me, I saw it as a step forward. Fortunately, I quickly found a buyer, and my mother had no choice but to leave the house when the eviction notice came. After cutting ties with my mother and sister, my life changed dramatically. It was also the moment I was freed from the burden I had carried for so many years. By choosing to live for myself, I found a quiet sense of peace within my heart. The first few weeks of no contact with my family felt strange. For the first time, the time I used to spend thinking about my mother and sister had completely disappeared. To fill that void, I set new goals for myself. I focused on work, improving my skills, and finding new hobbies. One day after work, I stopped by a cafe and found an opportunity to pursue something I had wanted to do for years, joining a photography class. Photography had been one of my dreams since high school, but it had been pushed aside amid the busyness of life. Learning at that class became a new source of inspiration for me, bringing vivid color back into my life. However, the guilt from cutting ties with my family didn't completely disappear. Occasionally, I received messages from my mother. Each time I saw them, I couldn't help but question whether my decision had been the right one. Even so, I felt that not replying was the only way to protect myself. Eventually, I decided to block my mother's email address. It was a form of closure for me. Some relatives criticized me, but those who knew about the incident at my mother's birthday party defended me. Now, my mother and sister have no family they can rely on and seem to be living quietly in a rundown apartment. Having realized that the house they once lived in was not their asset, I wonder how much inheritance my mother actually has left. There are rumors that she has started working part-time, so it seems unlikely she has anything substantial to leave to my sister. Taking care of yourself is not the same as betraying someone. With those words etched in my heart, I slowly started to rebuild my life at my own pace. On my days off, I went on trips with friends and began participating in volunteer activities, making an effort to expand my social circle. A few months passed, and I finally felt that my life had reached a stable point. My new apartment was a small space, but it was a place where I felt secure. The simple furniture and the landscape photos I had taken at the photography class symbolized my new life. One afternoon, I took some time to reflect on the past. The support Solomon had given me, my efforts to help my mother and sister, and the perseverance I had shown, all of these were experiences that shaped who I am today. There were undoubtedly painful moments in my journey, moments that felt as if they would overwhelm me completely. These moments weren't fleeting, they lingered, etched into my memory like scars that told stories of survival and growth. Yet, in hindsight, I came to understand that these challenges, no matter how overwhelming they seemed at the time, ultimately made me stronger. They shaped me into someone who could face adversity, someone who could stand tall, even when the world felt like it was crumbling around me. Each struggle, each disappointment, and each sacrifice I made acted as a stepping stone, guiding me toward rediscovering my own worth. For years, I had placed others' needs above my own, questioning whether my efforts even mattered or if I deserved any happiness for myself. But now, as I reflected on all that had happened, I realized that those struggles were not in vain. While driving one day, a surprising sensation crept over me. I felt a genuine smile spreading across my face. It wasn't a forced expression or something fleeting, it was a deep and unshakable smile that came from within. It was the kind of smile that only arises when the weight of the past begins to lift and peace takes its place. I felt light, as if the heavy burdens I had carried for so long had finally been lifted off my shoulders. The chains of obligation that had tethered me to my family's problems had been broken, freeing me in ways I hadn't imagined possible. The air seemed clearer, the road smoother, and the horizon brighter. It was in that moment I realized all the struggles I had endured, the tears I cried, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices had finally paid off. They had led me here, to this sense of peace and freedom that I had thought was unattainable. Their problems, the ones that had consumed so much of my life, were no longer my problems to solve. I had stepped away from their shadows, and for the first time I could focus on myself without guilt or hesitation. I was finally ready to walk my own path, one that was shaped by my dreams, my choices, and my desires, not by the weight of others' expectations. "This is my new beginning," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible yet filled with conviction and hope. As I pressed down on the accelerator, I felt the car surge forward, responding to my will. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a winding path that disappeared into the vast horizon. Above me, the wide-open sky, with its brilliant shades of blue, felt like a promise of infinite possibilities and uncharted adventures. The journey ahead was unknown, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of what I might encounter. With each mile I drove, I felt as though I was shedding the layers of my past, the pain, the doubts, the sacrifices. I was leaving them behind, letting them fade into the distance as I focused on what lay ahead. This drive wasn't just about covering physical distance, it was about moving forward emotionally, reclaiming my sense of self, and embracing the freedom I had fought so hard to achieve. The road before me wasn't merely a path, it was a symbol of the life I was ready to build for myself, a life rooted in self-love and independence. The car hummed beneath me, steady and reliable, as if it too understood the significance of this journey. With each turn of the wheel, I felt myself moving closer to a brighter, freer, and more fulfilling future. This moment, this drive, was more than just a physical escape. It was the start of something profound. I had finally chosen myself, and that choice filled me with a joy I hadn't experienced in years. "This is my new beginning," I repeated, the words echoing in my mind like a mantra. Ahead of me stretched an open road, boundless and inviting, with a sky so vast it seemed to hold every possibility I could imagine. My name is Rebecca, and I am 30 years old. For a long time, I have been struggling with a complex family environment. It all began when I was 20 years old. At that time, I was a lively and hopeful second-year college student, majoring in psychology. Inspired by a therapist who supported me after the loss of my father during my childhood, I had set myself a high goal to become a clinical psychologist. My academic life was flourishing, and I was blessed with good friends. I enjoyed spending time with my peers and even had plans to study abroad the following year. However, everything changed when my 52-year-old mother, Helen, became unable to continue her work due to a severe chronic illness. The illness caused damage to her joints and muscles, subjecting her to constant pain and gradually limiting her mobility. Doctors informed us that there was no fundamental treatment for her progressive disease. At that time, my younger sister, Sarah, was only 15 years old and a high school student. She was full of typical teenage rebelliousness, spending her days in a moody state and immersing herself in video games. Our father had died in a traffic accident when Sarah was still an infant. Since then, our family of 3 had been supporting each other. Our mother had supported our household as a legal secretary, but with the onset of her illness, she could no longer continue working. As her condition worsened, I felt a strong responsibility to support our family. Sitting in my small dorm room, facing a desk scattered with psychology textbooks, I realized that I had to give up the dreams I had envisioned. It was not an easy decision to make. However, there were no other realistic options available. My mother needed regular care and treatment, and it was too much to expect Sarah to take on such responsibilities at her young age. The day I went to the administrative office to withdraw from college is still etched in my memory. My advisor tried earnestly to persuade me to stay, suggesting part-time attendance or taking a leave of absence, but I knew those options would not suffice to support our household financially. Our family urgently needed economic support, and there was no time to wait. At the age of 20, I dropped out of college and started working full-time. My first job was as a receptionist at a small local accounting firm. Although the salary was modest, it was stable, and by moving back home to live with my mother and Sarah, we could save on rent. The first few months were incredibly tough. I had left behind the stimulating lectures and study groups I had in college for a routine of answering phones and doing clerical work. In the evenings, I would support my mother's rehabilitation and ensure that Sarah did not fall behind in her studies. At night, I often questioned whether my decision was the right one, but I always managed to motivate myself and chose to move forward. I once believed that a day would come when my mother's condition would stabilize, Sarah would grow independent, and I could return to school. Even as that hope faded over time, I could not let go of the possibility. As years passed, the dream seemed increasingly distant, but I continued to hold on to hope while facing reality. I started as a receptionist, but eventually was promoted to an administrative position, which slightly increased my salary, allowing me to cover our family's living expenses and my mother's medical costs. I made sure Sarah had everything she needed for school, including supplies, clothes, and funds for field trips. I was filled with the desire to provide her with the opportunities I had given up on. Thanks to my efforts, Sarah was able to graduate from high school with scholarships and support paved for her way to college. I was incredibly proud of her. It was a joy to know that at least one member of our family would achieve a degree. The moment she received her acceptance letter and tears of happiness spilled over. I took her to an ice cream shop to celebrate, just as my parents had done for me when I had performed well in school as a child. During that time, I had temporarily sealed away my dreams, given up on furthering my education, and sacrificed travel plans and personal time to dedicate myself entirely to caring for my mother and supporting Sarah. I was exhausted, but I kept telling myself, this is for the sake of the family. It was hard not to feel envious or dissatisfied when I saw posts from my college friends about their successful careers and vibrant new lives on social media. However, there were moments of joy, such as when my mother had a good day and we could enjoy old movies together, or when Sarah called from college, happily sharing her good grades and stories of new friends. These events made me feel that the efforts and sacrifices I had made were not in vain. Over time, however, I increasingly felt unappreciated, and it seemed as if my struggles were being taken for granted. Although my mother's condition was stabilizing, she still required a lot of care. She often lamented how difficult her life was, but rarely mentioned the efforts and sacrifices I had made. Sometimes she would say harsh things like, "You should be doing better, or other daughters would do more for their parents." These words hurt, but I pretended not to care. Meanwhile, Sarah's attitude changed significantly after she started college life. Initially, she would call weekly, excitedly talking about her classes and campus events. However, the frequency of her calls gradually decreased. Now, she mostly contacted us when she needed financial support or specific help, and she seldom asked about our mother or me. When I look at Sarah's social media, I see her enjoying time with her new college friends and pictures from spring break trips that are far beyond my reach. Every time I saw that, I felt the gap between us widen even more, and I was utterly clueless about how to bridge that distance. Even when Sarah returned home for vacations, she spent most of her time with her high school friends and showed little interest in our mother or me at home. However, a turning point came last week when Sarah graduated from college. Despite everything, I was genuinely happy for her success and filled with pride. I had been preparing for months and decided to gift her a simple yet high-quality watch for her graduation. It was not flashy, but I thought it would be suitable for job interviews. Remembering the thrill I felt when my father gave me my first watch at 16, I wanted Sarah to experience that special moment too. The graduation ceremony was emotional, and I was moved to tears as Sarah walked across the stage to receive her diploma. However, at the graduation party that followed, my mother and I were treated as mere background elements. Sarah spent most of her time with her college friends and her new, stylish boyfriend, Wesley. Wesley's cold glances made us feel like unwelcome intruders. When I approached Sarah to give her the gift, she dismissed me, saying she was too busy. I stood there, holding the present, feeling incredibly awkward and saddened. Holding back tears, I quietly sat in a corner of the party. That's when I overheard Sarah talking with Wesley. She was telling a group of friends how embarrassed she was by her family and how eager she was to move out and start a new job. She said she was tired of us dragging her down and planned never to contact us again once she left home. I was shocked and pained to hear such cold words from my sister, whom I had loved and supported at the expense of my own life. Remembering all the nights I helped with her homework or gave her money for college instead of spending it on new clothes or hairstyles for myself, a rush of indescribable feelings overwhelmed me. That's how she really felt about us. The next day, I confronted her about her words. Hoping for an apology, I was instead met with harsh criticism. She said it was pathetic that I had sacrificed my life for our mother and that she never asked for that. She accused me of being jealous of her success and trying to make her feel guilty. During our argument, our mother, far from defending me, claimed I was being dramatic. She said I should just let Sarah be and be happy for her. At 30, with no degree and a stagnant job, caring for an unappreciative mother and a sister who despised me, I felt my youth slipping away. I was seriously thinking that I needed to find somewhere new to rediscover myself and spend some time focusing on my own needs. Yet, I felt guilty about the thought of abandoning my mother without any support, especially if her health worsened. But as these thoughts haunted me, I realized I needed to properly communicate my feelings to my mother and Sarah. I rehearsed what I wanted to say over and over in my head, carefully choosing words that wouldn't sound accusatory. I invited Sarah over to try and reconcile. I suggested we go out for dinner together. And although she agreed reluctantly, I spent the day cleaning the house and making our mother's favorite lasagna, hoping for a moment of family warmth that might soften everyone's hearts. However, the evening quickly turned for the worse. Our mother started by accusing me of trying to make her feel guilty for being sick. "I never asked you to quit college. It was your own choice, wasn't it? Do you think I wanted to mess up your life by getting sick?" she continued, and then brought up how she had cared for her sick father for years without complaining. I tried to explain that I wasn't blaming her, just wanting to express my gratitude, but she wouldn't listen. Sarah mostly kept silent, saying I was being too sensitive and she didn't mean it that way. But the look on her face made it clear she was serious about what she had said. She began to talk about her achievements, her degree, job offers, and plans to move to the city. Looking at me, she said, "What have you done? You're almost 30, still living at home, working as a secretary." At that moment, I couldn't hold back my tears and sobbed as I told her how much she had hurt me. I asked why she treated everything like it was my fault. Our mother accused me of trying to create a conflict with Sarah. I said, "From now on, I won't help you at all, and I don't feel the need to be involved. I don't have to sacrifice myself to protect you anymore." They reacted to my statement as if I was acting like I was the only one suffering, saying, "Don't talk like that," to which I replied, "Looking back over these 9 years, my life has been miserable." It was then that I felt there was no reason for me to stay. Holding back tears, I walked out of the house. I have never felt such a tightness in my chest before. I am currently staying at my best friend Vanessa's house, pondering my next steps. Vanessa has been my friend since high school and is one of the few friends I've managed to keep in touch with over the years. She has always been on my side. Feeling guilty, I considered returning home, but then my mother started talking about how ungrateful I am. That was the decisive moment. I have ended all financial support for them, and I told my mother that I needed to leave home and have some time for myself. She tried to make me feel guilty by saying her health would worsen if I left, but I firmly resolved to leave. I suggested other solutions, such as hiring home care or asking my sister to help, but she refused, saying she couldn't trust anyone else. Afterwards, she sent me messages alternating between blaming me and begging me to come home. I have now blocked her number. I haven't heard from Sarah at all. Vanessa's apartment isn't large, but she has offered me a place to stay. It feels strange to have free time in the evenings without having to rush home to check on my mother or do household chores. I am still getting used to this quiet. I no longer have to worry about my mother calling for help. Finding myself again, not just as a caregiver, is still a bit difficult, but I am beginning to feel hopeful about my future for the first time in a long while. It has been a month since I left home. Living with Vanessa felt like a fresh breeze, and she has been a great support. With the savings I had accumulated over the years, I decided to enroll in community college. I am currently taking an introductory psychology class and an English writing class. Returning to school and studying again feels indescribably good. When I attended class for the first time in years, I was filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Having not been in school for a long time, I was worried about being the oldest in the class and whether I could keep up, but my worries were unfounded. There were several other adult students near my age in the class, and some were even older than me. Balancing household duties, work, and school has been very challenging, but social life in this new environment is a different kind of stress than I've experienced before. This stress feels like it's not just about surviving, but about growing. I have also started therapy to sort out my feelings about my family. Talking to a third party has been very beneficial. She has taught me how to set boundaries and increase my self-esteem. We have explored why I felt it was natural to sacrifice myself. Last week, I ran into my mother's sister, Lynn, at the supermarket. I have always been close to Lynn, and she has been like a second mother to me. She asked why I wasn't answering my mother's calls. I briefly explained my current situation. There are moments when I feel relieved that not all the burdens fall on me alone, especially since I had some support from work and family. One day, my aunt called me to a nearby cafe for an important talk. "Rebecca, our relatives all know how much you sacrificed for your mother and Sarah over the years. You dropped out of college at 20 and have supported the family ever since. I want to help you." My aunt decided to give me part of her inheritance. After various procedures, I received $50,000. This unexpected support has opened up great possibilities for my new life. But what pleased me more was that my decade-long efforts were finally recognized by someone. Thanks to my aunt's help, I have been able to take the first steps toward a new life. I have started looking for a new job. Last week, I applied for an entry-level position in the HR department of a local nonprofit organization and was hired. The salary is slightly higher than my current job and offers opportunities for career growth. Most importantly, the job is meaningful and aligns with my interests. Overall, I am cautiously optimistic as I continue to monitor my situation. I have also resumed hiking, a hobby I loved but hadn't had time for in years. I realize I have a long road ahead. It will take time to untangle the years of codependency and rebuild my life, but I am determined to proceed positively, no matter how difficult. Even when faced with challenges, I am learning to build trust in myself and my choices. As a result, significant changes have emerged that are markedly different from before. I was able to muster the necessary courage to make these changes. My deep interest in psychology has contributed to this. And for once, I want to experience being in a workplace where my efforts are recognized and appreciated. I am continuing with my community college classes, which are going well. Next year, I will earn my associate degree. Additionally, with the support from my aunt, I plan to transfer to a 4-year university to earn a bachelor's degree in psychology. Balancing school and work is not easy, but I am tackling it with more motivation than I have ever felt before. Thanks to living with Vanessa, I feel connected to the community, family, and friends. There are tough times, but I try not to dwell on them too much. With the help of my therapist, I am learning how to face these emotions and maintain proper boundaries. Sarah finally graduated and moved to another place to start her new job. She sent a message saying she wants me to keep doing well even in her absence. I did not reply to her message. It saddens me that our relationship could never be what it once was. I remember our close times, but I also recognize that I must accept the change. I hoped there would be an opportunity for us to talk in the future, but that surprisingly came sooner than expected. Before my sister moved out, we met up one more time. Upon arriving, I immediately considered leaving the room but ultimately decided to stay and listen to their side of the story. At first, it was quite tense, and the atmosphere was uncomfortable. My mother looked older and more exhausted than I remembered. I was briefly tormented by guilt, but then I remembered why I had decided to leave home in the first place. As the night went on, my mother gradually opened up and acknowledged the support I had provided her. She admitted that she had taken me for granted for many years and was afraid of completely losing me. She also shared that she is learning to prioritize herself in her future without being selfish. Challenges remain. I am still figuring out how to balance my own needs with compassion for others in a healthy way. I am working on forgiving my family without allowing myself to be used again. It's a process, and I know there will be good and bad days, but overall, I feel I am on the right path. I am proud of myself for having the courage to make these changes. 3 months after I left home, I received news from my Aunt Lynn that my mother had been hospitalized. She was rushed to emergency care due to a worsening autoimmune disease, and it was clear that she could no longer live alone. Since I had left, her condition had rapidly deteriorated. She often forgot to take her morning medication, struggled with rehabilitation on her own, and could not manage household tasks. She refused meal delivery services, saying she couldn't trust food prepared by others, and found it difficult to shop even at the nearby supermarket. Eventually, the refrigerator was left with only spoiled food, and she wasn't eating properly. After being hospitalized, she had no choice but to acknowledge the need for home care. She reluctantly accepted the help of a social worker and home health aides arranged by my aunt. During this time, I received an unexpected message from my sister Sarah. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you. Can we chat on the phone when you have time?" On the phone, she told me that our Aunt Lynn had shared with the whole family about my decade of dedication and the recent events from the onset of our mother's illness, my dropping out of college to work full-time, supporting her education, and her comments at the graduation party. Especially harsh criticism from our cousins Megan and Tiffany seemed too much for Sarah to bear. They were the same age and had been close friends with Sarah since their student days, so their words carried weight. "How could you say such things about your sister, who sacrificed her youth for 10 years, calling her a loser? Sarah, how could you not appreciate that the enjoyable college life you had was all thanks to your sister?" Facing criticism from relatives and the reality of our mother's hospitalization, Sarah seemed to deeply regret her actions. "Rebecca, I'm really sorry. I wanted to be acknowledged in my new environment, and I was a complete fool, ashamed of my own origins. I deluded myself into thinking that the success I had was solely due to my own efforts and not built on your sacrifices. I now understand how selfish and cruel that was." Sarah said she would fly back for the weekend. She wanted to think about what she could do regarding our mother's care and even offered to allocate part of her salary for our mother's caregiving expenses. I am not yet ready to fully accept Sarah's sudden apology. It will take time to determine whether her actions truly reflect her remorse, not just her words. "Rebecca, I want to take some time off to meet and talk in person," Sarah proposed. After some thought, I agreed to meet her for a short time over the weekend. She returned. Waiting at the cafe, Sarah appeared, looking a bit thinner than before. "Rebecca, I'm truly sorry. It was only after being pointed out by others that I realized the folly of my actions. Although we are apart, please let me support the caregiving costs with part of my monthly salary. Also, I'll use my long vacations to visit a few times a year to check on Mom. And I'll also keep in regular contact with her online." I didn't sense any deceit in Sarah's words, but based on past experiences, I couldn't immediately trust her. Would the promised financial support and regular contact truly continue? I plan to observe over time. As for our mother's condition, I occasionally receive updates through Aunt Lynn. Initially confused, she has gradually adapted to the caregiving service, and her relationship with the helpers is reportedly good. I'm not yet ready to meet her in person, but hearing that her life is getting back on track gives me some peace of mind. Aunt Lynn's actions have indeed sparked necessary changes in our family. However, only time will prove whether these changes are genuine. For now, I'm focusing on my studies and work, keeping a watchful eye from a distance to see if each family member fulfills their responsibilities. I have decided to walk my own path in life. While prioritizing my own happiness, I seek to find a proper balance with my family. That warm spring morning marked a pivotal point in my life. At just 4 years old, I loved waking up to the scent of my father's pancakes. On Sunday mornings, he would invariably prepare special pancakes for us. He crafted them into shapes like bears, rabbits, and sometimes even my beloved Mickey Mouse, generously topping them with maple syrup and whipped cream. In the kitchen, my mother would be setting the table while humming a tune. I waited on the living room sofa for breakfast to be ready, while clutching my favorite stuffed rabbit. "Lucy," my father's voice echoed from the kitchen. "The pancakes say they want you to flip them, not me." They say they taste better when you do it." Wielding a frying pan, he swung the spatula around like a magic wand. I jumped off the sofa laughing, placed my rabbit down, and rushed to the kitchen. In that moment, everything changed. The spatula fell to the floor with a clatter. My father clutched his chest, his face contorted in pain, and then he collapsed to the floor, my mother's screams filling the air. "Honey, stay with me." What followed is a blur in my memory. The sound of an ambulance siren, my mother breaking down in tears in the sterile white corridor of the hospital, and the image of my father never to return. After his death, my mother was submerged in profound grief. The vibrant and lively woman she once was became shadowed by days filled with tears and sighs. At 4, I had no way to ease her sorrow. All I could do was watch by her side. Yet, scared of leaving her alone, every time she broke down, I could only gently grasp her sleeve with my small hand. The heavy, somber air that hung over our home weighed mercilessly, even on my young self. A year after laughter had vanished from our home, my mother met a man named Wayne at a support group for single parents where he worked. His smile, which reminded me a bit of my father, initially made me feel uneasy. That day, just like my father, he had smiled serenely before collapsing right before my eyes. Every time I remembered my inability to do anything, a tightness gripped my chest. Every time I saw Wayne's smile, I struggled between wanting to believe in him and instinctual caution, troubled by how natural his kindness seemed, as if something might be hidden behind it. However, Wayne truly was a gentle soul. His kindness wasn't forced. It naturally brought comfort to those around him. Initially distant, I gradually opened up to him as I saw how he cared for my fragile mother and worked to bring back smiles to our family. Soon after, my mother and Wayne's relationship quickly progressed, and they got married. Wayne was an ideal stepfather. He showed genuine interest in my education, always attended school events, and even filmed me at sports days, waving through the crowd. "Lucy, the sky's the limit for your future." His words became my confidence. His words were like magic, gently nudging me forward whenever I was afraid to step out. Supported by his words, I slowly gained the courage to try new things. Within a year of their wedding, my mother had big news to share. She was pregnant with Wayne's child. Her face lit up with happiness. "Lucy, you're going to be a big sister," she announced, her voice vibrant with life for the first time in ages. In that moment, though I was speechless, the hope and joy in my mother's eyes made me smile spontaneously. I couldn't imagine what the future would hold with this new life, but the air seemed to warm up softly around us. Resolved to support my mother, I felt, just slightly, that I had grown up a bit. Yet, simultaneously, a hint of anxiety sprouted in my heart. Ted's arrival brought more change than anticipated. At the time, I had just turned 6. Initially, I enjoyed helping take care of the baby. I vividly remember the moment Ted first smiled and the feel of his tiny hand gripping my finger. However, my mother's changes gradually became apparent. First, she quit her job as an elementary school teacher. She said it was because she wanted to spend more time with her family. Whenever someone questioned her decision, that was how my mother responded. "This time is crucial for a child's development." I often wanted to ask her, wasn't my childhood important too? It seemed to me that she was always busy with Ted, and I felt a pang of loneliness and jealousy. My mother's world increasingly revolved around Ted. She forgot my school events. For lunch, she would apologize. "Sorry, Lucy. I had to make a doctor's appointment for Ted today, so I didn't have time to prepare anything." Even dinner conversations centered around Ted. It wasn't a one-time event, it became our new normal. Wayne was the only one who noticed. He saw the lonely expression on my face as I watched my mother engrossed with Ted. Quietly but surely, I faded from my mother's view. One evening, as I was working on my homework alone, Wayne joined me. "Lucy, You see, he asked in a gentle voice, pointing to a math problem. Sometimes people get so focused on one thing that they can't see other important things around them. As Ted grew older, the issues in our family environment became undeniable. Wayne tried several times to discuss Ted's excessive attachment to my mother, but she always became defensive and angry. One night, when Ted was about 5 years old during dinner, he was playing with his food, arranging it around his plate. My mother sat next to him and softly suggested, "Don't play with your food. How about one more bite?" "Sandra," Wayne said, putting down his fork, "lately you've been too wrapped up in taking care of Ted. He's already 5 years old. He needs to start doing some things on his own." My mother's expression hardened instantly. "What do you mean by that? Are you saying I'm a bad mother?" Her voice trembled. "You're not just Ted's parent. You also have a daughter, Lucy, and a husband, me. Could you please pay a little more attention to Lucy and me as well?" Wayne replied calmly. I pretended to be engrossed in my mashed potatoes while not missing a word of their conversation. "Ted is still so small. A child needs their mother," my mother exclaimed. "I'm still just a grade schooler too," I murmured under my breath, but it seemed like no one heard me. The breaking point in my relationship with my mother came when Wayne suggested enrolling Ted in judo classes. Pretending to do homework on the stairs, I listened to their argument in the kitchen. "Absolutely not." My mother's voice grew shrill. "Do you know how dangerous judo can be? He could sprain his ankle or even break a bone." "It's for Ted's sake, Sandra," Wayne said wearily. "Parents can't protect their children from everything. That's why it's important for them to experience various things and learn." My mother refused to let Ted join judo. Instead, she enrolled him in a city painting class. I still remember those days. While other kids were earnestly trying to paint, Ted just listlessly moved his brush. He quit after only 3 sessions, and my mother blamed the teachers for not recognizing her son's talents. During this time, Wayne spent more time with me, perhaps trying to balance my mother's behavior, or maybe he just felt guilty for seeing me as a child in need of a mother. He took me to karate classes 3 times a week. Every time I earned a new belt, he cheered louder than any other parent. However, as I grew under Wayne's protection, Ted became increasingly unruly. His room was a mess of toys and clothes. One day, my mother looked at me and said, "Lucy, please, could you clean up Ted's room?" I was becoming increasingly resentful of these requests, knowing they were actually commands. Wayne became furious when he found out about this exchange. "Sandra, Lucy is not her brother's maid," he protested. "Ted needs to learn to clean up after himself." That's when my mother played her final card, breaking down in tears. "You prefer your daughter, don't you?" she sobbed. "Why are you so cold to Ted?" I saw Wayne's expression cloud over. I could feel his disappointment in my mother. He looked at me apologetically, then raised his hands in surrender. "All right, have it your way." After that, he stopped arguing with my mother about Ted, but I could feel his affection for me in his gaze. He might have given up discussing Ted's upbringing with my mother, but he hadn't given up on me. It was a small hope, but sometimes a little hope can be a salvation. My high school graduation was bittersweet. Dressed in my cap and gown, I searched for Wayne in the crowd. He was smiling proudly, but my mother was probably texting Ted's babysitter. She must have been too concerned about leaving him with a sitter. She didn't look at me even once. That evening, Wayne called me to his study. "I've been saving for your future," he began, pulling out a folder stuffed with university pamphlets. "Lucy, the possibilities for your future are limitless. Choose your college wisely." Before I could respond, my mother barged in. "I won't allow it. That money should be saved for Ted's future," she screamed. Wayne's face hardened. It was a look I had seen many times during their conflicts. "This is non-negotiable, Sandra. I've already decided. If you can't make your daughter happy, I will," he stated firmly. I ultimately chose a university far from home, but still within a distance that allowed for occasional visits. Wayne helped me move into my apartment on the day of the move. My mother did not come. She said Ted was anxious about me moving out. College life was everything I had dreamed of. Attending college was my chance to escape the shadow of being an unloved child and finally find myself. Though I made sure to call home every week, most of my conversations were with Wayne. My mother was always too busy with Ted, rarely having time for a real talk with me. During that time, I was so caught up in the joys of college life that I didn't notice the dark clouds gathering over our family. It was my sophomore year when I started to notice a change in Wayne. Our weekend calls became shorter, and sometimes he didn't answer the phone at all. At first, I thought he was just busy with work, but the truth was far more serious. One day, my mother called in a panic. She had accidentally found multiple debt collection notices in Wayne's desk drawer. The total was shockingly large, all stemming from debts incurred through gambling. Engrossed in caring for Ted, my mother had been unaware of the situation. When I confronted Wayne, he admitted to having lost a large sum of money gambling. He had started gambling shortly after Ted was born. Initially, it was a way to relieve the stress from his relationship with my mother, starting with small amounts. However, it had escalated into a gambling addiction involving large sums. "Lucy, please do something." My mother's voice trembled. "The interest has grown, and it's become more than we can pay back." I immediately considered taking a break from school, but Wayne vehemently opposed it. "I turned to gambling and caused this mess. I can't let my problems ruin your life. I'll handle it." He sobbed over the phone. Yet, gambling addiction isn't something one can easily solve alone. I thought about what I could do for Wayne, who had supported me since childhood. While continuing my studies, I took on more part-time jobs, began saving money, and cut down on expenses. I also consulted a specialist in gambling addiction, created a recovery plan for Wayne, and got him into a treatment program and a support group. Most importantly, we established a financial management system. Under the guidance of a money management counselor, we implemented a strict budgeting system. I took over the household finances, and Wayne was allowed to have only small amounts of cash on him. Recovering from gambling addiction was by no means easy. Wayne nearly relapsed several times and sometimes seemed to lose hope. However, with the support of our family and his own strong will, he gradually made progress. 2 years later, Wayne was able to completely give up gambling. This experience significantly strengthened our bond. He came to think of me not just as the daughter of his remarried spouse, but as his own daughter. However, the happy days did not last long. One day Wayne fell ill and was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis was terminal cancer. From then on, our days were filled with uncertainty. His battle with the illness was brief, and we hardly had time to say goodbye. I still remember feeling utterly powerless as I could only watch by his bedside. His condition worsened suddenly, and I wasn't even able to be there for his final moments. Weeks before his death, he held my hand and said, "Lucy, you are my pride. You saved me. Thank you so much." Wayne's death cast a deep shadow over our family. Regret and sorrow welled up in my heart, and despite the passage of time, a vast emptiness remained. Yet, I began to make an effort to move forward. During college, I studied hard in the library during the day and worked nights at a cafe to earn scholarships, desperately maintaining my grades. This effort paid off, and after graduation, I landed a job at a top company. Approximately 2 years after Wayne's death, during my senior year of college, my work experience and achievements at the company were recognized. Gradually, I was able to establish and stabilize my career. By the age of 27, I was able to buy my own apartment. Yet my mother sank into deep sorrow again, her obsession with Ted seemingly growing stronger. Then, several years after Wayne's death, I received news that my grandfather had passed away at my mother's childhood home. During the inheritance proceedings, it was revealed that my grandfather had left a will. Surprisingly, the will stated that all his assets were to be left to Ted. It became clear that my mother had secretly asked my grandfather to write this will before his death, revealing just how wealthy her family was. My grandfather had been one of the leading real estate magnates in the region, possessing immense wealth. He held traditional values, believing that the family estate should be passed on to male descendants. However, as an only daughter, my mother was very much spoiled and favored by him. It was she who had asked him to do this. One day, I received a call from my grandfather's lawyer informing me that my grandfather had made a will leaving everything to Ted. There was nothing left for me. Why? I asked my mother. You're talented and can make it on your own, right? Ted needs a special environment. With this inheritance, his future is secure. She coldly replied. However, the reality was far from what my mother expected. Ted, having been pampered from birth, had no understanding of the value of money. Ted recklessly spent money, making unauthorized credit cards in my mother's name to buy games, high-performance gaming PCs, and computer peripherals, indulging in spending sprees with friends he met at school and in online games. He also ventured into luxury brands, becoming obsessed with assembling flashy clothes and accessories to showcase his status. Eventually, he ventured into real estate investment. With no business or real-life experience, he easily fell prey to fraudulent investment schemes. Targeted by local unscrupulous dealers, he was persuaded to buy high-priced properties, resulting in vacancies in areas with many empty houses and struggling to make monthly repayments, far from making any profit. Within 2 years, the vast inheritance was depleted, and he had accumulated a substantial amount of debt. As friends who could lend a hand became scarce, the days of struggling to repay debts continued, and he increasingly felt isolated. Hearing about Ted's financial troubles due to his wasteful spending, I decided to forge my own path. Then, on a Tuesday evening, I received a call from my mother. When I visited, a woman who looked 20 years older than her actual age stood before me. She had lost her former glamour, appeared tired. The mother I once knew had vanished. Deep wrinkles marked her face, and the traces of once glamorous rings were visible on her thinned arms. After Wayne's death, my mother and brother had moved into the house where my deceased grandfather had lived, supposedly starting a new life. The house is a bit messy, my mother said, somewhat apologetically. Messy was an understatement. The luxury furniture had perhaps been sold, replaced by cheap substitutes, and old stains were prominent on the walls. A mountain of dirty dishes filled the sink. The house, once known for its immaculate cleanliness, was now on a path of decay. Mom, what happened? My mother avoided eye contact as she spoke. Ted made some mistakes in real estate investment. But there's a new investment opportunity, and if that goes well. I couldn't help but smirk. Did he get scammed again? What happened to Grandpa's inheritance? Isn't Ted still young? Didn't you stop him? He just believed in the potential. It's everyone else who deceived him. It's not our fault. My mother's voice rose in pitch. The usual excuses began. My mother's voice, defending Ted, now sounded hollow to me. As I looked out the window while she made excuses, I could see the light in Ted's room. The flicker of his gaming screen was evident. Finally, my mother got to the point. Lucy, please, we need your help. Her voice trembled. We'll lose the house if this continues. You're working at a good company now, right? Even just the monthly mortgage. I knew what she wanted to say, but found myself unable to articulate the words I kept starting to say. A part of me felt guilty for not being able to refuse. In the end, without saying much, I set up a monthly transfer of $1,000 to my mother's account, even if it meant cutting into my savings for the future. I kept telling myself it was the right thing to do, yet I sometimes felt like I was giving up on my dreams and hopes. I wondered how long this situation would continue as anxiety welled up within me. But instead of improving, the situation only worsened. The last straw was the appearance of Ted's girlfriend, Ashley. Even after Ted had accrued massive debts, she not only stayed with him but also moved into my parents' house. She drank all the expensive imported wine I had bought, leaving the empty bottles as is. The Tupperware from the supermarket lunchboxes and prepared dishes she bought remained unwashed, scattered around the table and sink. Her arrogant attitude seemed to mock my efforts. Even as I put down groceries I had bought, she wouldn't even look up. She just lay on the only luxury sofa left in the house, continuously scrolling on her smartphone. "I'm paying for you to live here. If you're going to stay, at least help out with the chores." I raised my voice. Ashley was completely indifferent to the fact that the money I sent my mother every month was supporting their lifestyle. Slowly lifting her head, Ashley smirked spitefully. "Well, Lucy, I'm here because Ted, your brother, allows it. After all, this house originally belongs to his grandfather. And why should I do the chores? If they need to be done, you can do them yourself or hire a maid, right? You're the high earner, aren't you?" Her words were the final trigger. Indeed, this house was built on the wealth my grandfather had accumulated, and it was in Ted's name. Since my father died when I was 4, I had been making excuses while trying to earn my mother's love. I supported Wayne's recovery and gave my all to rebuild our family. But what was all my effort for? In the end, to them, I was just a convenient housekeeper who could earn money. I quietly stood up and left the room. Ashley's triumphant laughter echoed down the hallway. During the 4-hour drive from my mother's house to my apartment, I was gripping the steering wheel almost unconsciously. When I arrived at my apartment, sat down on the sofa, and opened the bank's website to make a remittance to my mother, I finally decided what I should do. A month later, as expected, a call came from my mother. "Lucy, what's wrong?" "The money hasn't been transferred." "Yes, I've decided to stop sending money." "What? What did you say?" My mother's voice flipped. "Who do you think raised you to this point?" "Mom?" I interrupted calmly. "What have you ever done for me? Left all of Grandpa's inheritance to Ted. Continued to spoil Ted even as Wayne was trying to rebuild our family. You're just jealous." My mother yelled. "Didn't I tell you Ted needed a special environment? You've grown up just fine without me. You haven't changed. Goodbye, Mom." I said that and hung up the phone, immediately blocking my mother's number. But my mother didn't give up. She sent various messages through Messenger, email, and acquaintances. A cold daughter who tramples on her poor mother's heart. A sister who can't understand her delicate brother's struggles. The excuses, typical of my mother's flair for them, were impressively crafted. 6 months later, my mother and brother, having lost my financial support, struggled to make ends meet and finally had to sell Grandpa's house and move to a smaller apartment. My mother, despite holding a teaching license, couldn't secure a teaching job and was desperately juggling multiple jobs to support the household, but life didn't get any easier. Ted, though he took on part-time jobs, couldn't stick with them and was suffering. His attempts to rely on former friends were futile as those relationships, based largely on money, offered no real trust, and he was often coldly turned down with, "I can't right now." Ashley, who had been Ted's girlfriend, moved out to live alone in a small apartment after they broke up during the sale of Grandpa's house. Unable to forget her previous lifestyle, she continued buying luxury goods, accumulating debt, and her apartment became a mess, leading to a lonely existence as no one visited. Even if they find themselves in a tough situation, I can't reach out to help. I believe it has nothing to do with me. I have my own life and the right to live it. Family ties aren't necessarily defined by blood alone. Sometimes, to protect oneself, it's necessary to create distance. Wayne once said during his recovery from gambling addiction, "Sometimes, people need to hit rock bottom to change." Now, I understand the meaning of those words well. Until Ted and my mother take responsibility for their own lives, there's nothing I can do for them. I continue to walk forward, looking ahead. Their problems are no longer mine. After a long struggle, I have finally found true freedom.